The United Nations nuclear watchdog says Iran is testing new uranium enrichment equipment. European officials say that that move is defiant and a message to the UN Security Council, which is weighing possible sanctions now against Iran. With me is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. Ambassador, it's great to have you here today.
Glad to be here.
So, let's talk a little bit about Iran and what they've been doing. They're clearly trying to push the envelope in light of the sanctions that they see that have been put in place against North Korea. What message are you getting from them, and what do you think is the next move from the UN?
I think this is very consistent with what the government of Iran has been saying for some time. They're not going to give up uranium enrichment. They're not going to give up the pursuit of nuclear weapons, despite a lot of potential incentives that the Europeans have offered them. And we made it clear that even the United States would be willing to sit down and talk to them, sit down and talk to the world's central banker for terrorism because of our concern on the nuclear front. They've resisted it, so we'll go ahead for sanctions.
How much of the strategy with Iran is being dealt with by North Korea in terms of how the sanctions are in North Korea? North Korea clearly feels squeezed enough to say, if you keep doing this to us, we're going to keep testing. How much of that is an example for Iran?
Well, I think Iran should be watching this very carefully, because the international reaction to the North Korean nuclear test was as strong as I've ever seen, including particularly by China, that enabled us to get a unanimous Security Council resolution imposing very strict sanctions on North Korea. The sanctions we'll be looking at for Iran are not quite the same because it's a somewhat different situation. But the point to Iran is that their continued effort to get nuclear weapons will result in their continuing international isolation.
When you look at China and their cooperation, how convinced are you that you have the will to keep up these tough sanctions and that they won't sort of fade over time, that the power of them won't fade over time?
Well, that's a test. I think the initial reaction from China was quite strong. I think Secretary Rice's visit there has reinforced the strength of that opinion. But really the question is, over the long term, to make sure that North Korea cannot acquire the technology and the materials that it needs to continue its weapons and ballistic missile programs. And in a sense, we face something similar to that with respect to Iran, to deny them the ability to do this on their own.
Is there any force within the UN, and in terms of political change in these two environments? Because there's two ways to go about it. You can try to cut off the nuclear weapons capability, and then you can try to encourage change from within the structures of these countries. Is there talk about that? Is there any encouragement along those lines at all?
Nobody at the United Nations talks about that sort of thing. We have a different vision, obviously. We hope that in Iran, a democratic government can emerge that's truly elected to the people. Our goal in Korea has been the same since 1945. We want the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula, obviously under a democratic government. Those are both somewhat more in the future, and it's not something that people at the UN like to talk about.
And why is that?
Because if you talked about changing regimes from authoritarian or semi-authoritarian to democracies in the UN, you'd have a lot of countries quite unhappy. But I think that's something the United States and its friends should be pursuing on their own, because that is our ultimate objective. If you had countries that were responsive to the public will, unlike, say, North Korea or Iran, I think the odds are considerably reduced that they'd want to spend their scarce resources on nuclear weapons.
So it doesn't bother the countries at the United Nations that they have a government like Kim Jong-il's government that's so repressive to their people, that are starving people. They're more concerned with protecting their right to do what they're doing than they are the people of the country?
They should be a lot more concerned with what's going on inside North Korea and inside Iran as well. But the issue that we're trying to do, trying to handle in the UN, is to mobilize international support to isolate these regimes economically and politically if we can. That puts pressure on them internally. I think that helps democratic forces in those countries or in their diasporas.
How confident are you that sanctions will work against North Korea and separately against Iran in the end?
I think that it's something we have to see over time, and what it says to us is these sanctions alone that we've gotten against North Korea and the ones we hope to get soon against Iran are not the only steps we're taking. And if it's clear that they're not sufficient to dissuade North Korea or Iran from pursuing nuclear weapons, we'll consider other steps as well, because the objective is to keep them from being effective nuclear powers. We don't want to get lost in the process. We want to keep our eye on the ultimate objective. One
of the obvious concerns is that other neighboring countries will want to take on nuclear weapons and build nuclear weapons as well. And North Korea has made some suggestion that they don't care. They'd like to see that, in a sense. They'd like to see all those countries pull out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. How likely is that to happen, you think?
Well, I think it's a very great concern for us. That's why we call it proliferation. Each country that gets a nuclear capacity or that seeks to acquire nuclear capacity provides an incentive to its near neighbors to go after nuclear weapons as well for their own protection. So in the case of North Korea, we would worry that other countries in the region might seek nuclear weapons. In the Middle East, each new state that gets one makes an already volatile situation even worse. That's why dealing successfully with North Korea and Iran are so critical for us and our friends and allies.
I just have time for one more question, but how far away do you think Iran is from achieving nuclear weapons? When you read the papers, you hear a different time span from 6 years to 6 months for the rest of us. What do you think?
Well, there are all kinds of different estimates. They're based on assumptions, and reasonable people can disagree. Here's the key point. There's no doubt that Iran has been pursuing a strategic decision for close to 20 years that they want nuclear weapons. That's the fact we have to act upon.
All right, Ambassador Bolton, good to have you here.
Great.
Hope to see you again soon. Thanks for coming in.